Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Antoine Chistivalé, je suis coordonnateur à la Société historique du Canada pour notre série de tables rondes et d'ateliers virtuels. Je vous remercie d'être ici pour ce 4e atelier de notre série et le dernier de l'année 2022. C'est un atelier bilingue aujourd'hui en français et en anglais. Alors, son titre en anglais est How to write an effective peer review assessment of a history journal old book manuscript and how to avoid being the infamous reviewer number 2. En français, comment rédiger une évaluation efficace par les pairs d'une revue ou de manuscrit de livre et comment éviter d'être le ou la tristement célèbre deuxième examinateur ou examinatrice. So the interventions of the presenters will be recorded and accessible on the CHA's YouTube channel, but the recording will stop right before questions for the participants. So if ever you have some later on in the discussion, they will not be recorded as part of that meeting. And now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Amanda Ritchie to start us off for the meeting. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. Thank you very much for participating and attending this panel, especially during this extremely busy time of year. So I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion, which for me is taking place in Toronto. The area has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. I will very, very briefly introduce today's speakers before turning the floor over to them. So our first speaker is Robert Tygrob, who is a professor of history at TMU and a faculty member at the Free University of Berlin's International Summer and Winter University. His most recent book is 4 Days in Hitler's Germany, Mackenzie King's Mission to Avert a Second World War. He has served as the editor of the Canadian Journal of History, Annales Canadiennes d'Histoire, for the past 3 years. Our next speaker is Catherine Desbarras. Elle est co-directrice de la Canadian Historical Review avec sa collègue Penny Bryden. Elle enseigne à l'Université McGill où elle dirige le département d'histoire et d'études classiques. Elle est historienne de la Nouvelle-France et plus généralement du colonialisme français de l'époque moderne. Notre troisième conférencier, c'est Léon Robichaud, qui est professeur titulaire au département d'histoire de l'Université Sherbrooke, directeur de la revue d'histoire de l'Amérique française et co-directeur du laboratoire d'histoire et de patrimoine à Montréal, spécialiste de l'histoire sociale du politique en Nouvelle-France et des humanités numériques. Il s'intéresse aux relations entre les habitants et les autorités, ainsi qu'à l'utilisation des systèmes d'information géographique dans l'analyse des phénomènes sociaux. Our next speaker is Belinda Dodson. Belinda Dodson is a human geographer who specializes in gender and migration with a regional focus on Southern Africa. She is an adjunct research professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Western Ontario. She has been the coordinating editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies since 2015 and also serves on the editorial advisory boards of Gender, Place, and Culture and the Southern African Geographical Journal. Next, we have Len Husband, who has been at the University of Toronto Press for over 20 years, acquiring in the areas of Canadian history, history of science and medicine, religious studies, and philosophy. Before that, he worked at Oxford University Press Canada for 3 years. Last, we have Kyla Madden, who is senior editor at McGill Queen's University Press. Her acquisition areas include Canadian history, history of medicine, history of religion, and religious studies. So Robert, you are welcome to start us off.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And since I'm first, I have the sense that some of these issues will be also reiterated by others, so I won't go into a lot of detail and I'll leave some space for others to fill in as well. But on the subject of how to write a good review and to avoid being reviewer number 2, I think the overarching reminder is to write the review that you would like to receive. And especially considering that some of these submissions will be the first submissions that an author has provided to a journal. And especially in those cases, the reaction can be quite acute if a negative review is returned. So again, write the review that you'd like to receive. I'd also suggest reading the submission, if it's an article, and then putting it aside for a time. I know we're all pressed for time and we want to get through these things and power through the reading and writing it up. But I think sometimes just setting it aside and having some space to think about it and then reconsidering helps to put things in a bit of perspective. Some of this pretty standard, summarizing the main arguments as a way to begin the review, but I also think this is helpful because it's sometimes difficult to summarize the main arguments as a reviewer, and that is a good sign that some direction is needed in those areas. Recognize the mandate of the journal that you're writing for. Ours is a pretty general journal compared to some others that are more specialized, and some reviewers do a very good job of saying that this would be an appropriate review for a specialized journal, but not for a general journal like this. So understand the mandate of the journal. Prioritize areas of concern. So if there are some areas that are absolutely fundamental to getting this into publication shape, make that clear, setting up a kind of a hierarchy in the review. Some things that may be of interest to the writer in the future or could be taken under consideration versus those things that are absolutely necessary to again, bring this up to the standard. I'd also say write in a mode that recognizes subjectivity as opposed to the sort of voice of God review. So words like, in my opinion, or I think, give a bit of space, recognize that this is the subjective enterprise, but also come across as, I think, a little less pointed and kind of overwhelming to someone who's reading the review. Be as specific as possible, including if there are further areas of research that are required, naming some of the authors if necessary and possible. One thing that's really surprised me as I've been an editor for the past 3 years is the number of reviewers who say yes and then go AWOL. So please don't go AWOL. It's really problematic. There are people's careers, in many cases, promotions that are on the line. And so I understand that work and other things can get in the way, but at least be in touch with the journal if you're not going to be making a schedule, or if you decide that you don't have time to do this after all, as opposed to just radio silence. If at all possible, please don't demand that your own work be cited as a reviewer. This comes up a lot. In some areas, the area of consideration is quite specialized, and there is a limited amount of literature on the subject, and that's sometimes unavoidable, but recognize that this is not necessarily about you as the reviewer. And also recognize that you're not the copy editor. Now, sometimes line by line corrections are welcome and warranted, but especially if you're recommending that this submission not be accepted, an overwhelming list of all the problems with the writing, I don't think is as helpful as simply saying that better proofreading and editing is needed before this is submitted. I think that can sometimes be overwhelming as well.
Thank you very much. Kate, you are up.
Écoutez, je vais commencer en français et puis ça va se transformer en présentation en anglais par la suite pour évoquer un petit peu la nature du CHR où on fonctionne dans les deux langues. Donc, je me rejoins Robert pour remercier la Société historique pour avoir organisé l'atelier. Je pense que c'est une excellente idée. Et je commencerai peut-être par dire que c'est une occasion importante pour reconnaître le travail d'évaluation qui se fait. C'est du travail, par définition, la plupart du temps anonyme, donc invisible. Donc, avant de rentrer dans les détails de comment faire ça de façon utile, peut-être reconnaître que c'est une somme de travail collectif qui est très, très important et sans quoi nos revues ne peuvent pas fonctionner. Et puis, mal fait, effectivement, comme l'a souligné Robert, ça peut dévaster, ça peut décourager, et pire, un travail qui a peut-être du potentiel peut se retrouver à la poubelle à la fin, tellement l'auteur est découragé. Donc, effectivement, c'est important de réfléchir à comment bien faire ce travail. Je suis à la revue CHR d'abord en tant que directrice associée et puis maintenant co-directrice. C'est ma 3e année et je dois dire que dans l'ensemble, je suis en fait pas mal impressionnée par la qualité des évaluations qui se font. Donc, en fait, c'est une bonne nouvelle. Les gens, en général, respectent le genre de choses que Robert vient de décrire. Et je souligne en fait l'importance de ceci en temps de pandémie. Les gens sont de mauvaise humeur, les gens sont fatigués, mais en général, ils n'ont pas fait des boucs émissaires des auteurs. Bon, avec peut-être une ou deux exceptions. Donc, effectivement, il est crucial que nous faisons tous notre part en ces temps difficiles pour contribuer à une culture constructive dans le processus d'évaluation. Et justement, cet atelier, je pense, est assez important. Ce que je vais faire, là, je vais commencer peut-être par concrétiser un petit peu ce que Robert a dit pour sa revue. C'est vous rappeler que les revues, souvent, ont des consignes détaillées pour les évaluateurs qui décrivent les critères, etc. etc. Et est-ce que je peux partager mon écran rapidement juste pour faire ce jeu-là OK, Amanda, c'est ton...
Je peux essayer de te mettre sur comme co-hôte, Catherine.
OK. Merci. Ce n'est pas crucial, mais ça m'aiderait. Je veux juste vous montrer ce à quoi ça ressemble, les consignes aux auteurs et le fait de ne pas sauter cette étape. Hein. Parfois, on nous demande de faire une évaluation et puis on ne lit pas tout ça, on se dit « je sais comment faire ça ». Donc, la page d'accueil du Canadian Historical Review, ils ont leur texte de consignes et je vais vous dire d'abord que c'est difficile à trouver. Au CHR, ce n'est pas du tout évident, mais c'est sous « For Authors ». OK, alors c'est sous « For Authors » et ensuite vous regardez dans « Submission Guidelines ». Et puis là, vous trouvez « Peer Review Guidelines ». OK, ça, ce n'est pas du tout évident. Donc, juste pour ceux qui évaluent pour la CHR, les consignes sont là et les voici. Ça ressemble un petit peu à ça. Donc, des consignes de 3 pages qui sont pas mal utiles. Et ce que je voulais, j'aimerais souligner 2 points saillants dans les consignes du CHR qui sont utiles, qui seraient utiles pour n'importe qui, n'importe quelle revue, etc. Et ça, c'est ce commentaire ici, élément d'une évaluation constructive. Les auteurs souhaitent recevoir des évaluations utiles et constructives, même si l'article est impropre à la publication. Okay? Alors, même si vous pensez que vous allez rejeter l'article, quelques commentaires constructifs sont quand même de rigueur. Soyez aussi précis que possible sans faire le travail de l'auteur. On va peut-être revenir à cette idée de ne pas faire le travail de l'auteur dans la discussion parce que ce n'est pas évident. Hein, la marge de ce qui est le travail de l'auteur, ce qui est le travail de l'évaluateur, ce n'est pas évident. Donc, ce premier point, être constructif, ça s'applique même dans les cas où on pense rejeter l'article. L'autre chose que contient les consignes du CHR qui sont utiles, ressources pour tout le monde, c'est cet article de Brian Martin, Writing a Helpful Referees Report, qui est ici. Okay? Donc, un petit article de 5 pages ou dans ces eaux-là, qui est très utile pour, là encore, tout le monde. Hein? Et vous voyez dans le résumé, là, referees' reports are often demoralizing to authors. It's possible to write a report that's supportive and helpful by following 2 rules. Say what's good about a piece of work and say how it can be improved. Donc, c'est un petit peu le ton de l'article et qui trace un petit peu toute la dimension affective qui est en jeu lorsqu'on fait des évaluations. Hein? Parce que si vous regardez les politiques des revues, c'est « it's got to be impartial, objective, etc., etc. » La réalité, c'est que il y a beaucoup d'émotions de part et d'autre. Et puis, tout simplement en être conscient, ça, c'est déjà un bon début. Okay, so I think I'm going to continue in English because a lot of the... Well, it's just going to work that way. The gist of I think the segue of this English text is forcing me to go into English. Anyway, the gist of Brian Martin's article that's useful is that refereeing shouldn't be a blood sport, and that anonymous refereeing is not licensed to vent spleen. It can be. In some disciplines, it still is. I think historians are by and large don't do that, but it's just good to remember. So again, Martin's rules say what's good about a piece of work, tell the author how to improve it. And here's another quotation: by phrasing comments in terms of actions for improvement, we focus attention on what the author should do and not on the author's inadequacies. So those, I think, are just good principles to work with. I thought I would, in the time that remains to me, sort of, give you a few more of my own thoughts. And I guess they could be boiled down to a kind of Michael Pollan for historians. They eat food, mostly plants, not too much. And so I would say be timely, write with empathy, and be specific enough. And I'll make a few comments on each of those. So on the timeliness thing, this means a bunch of things, notamment responding quickly when you get the initial invitation. So, so this is kind of prior to the whole business of entering into the review. It's really important to respond reasonably quickly, and perhaps especially if you're going to say no, and that allows the editors to move on to the next person fairly quickly. If you're worrying about your workload, if the deadline you're given doesn't work, you can ask for an extension. And again, what the editors need is to know. And often when you yourself propose an extra deadline, you kind of own it a bit more. And you're, even if it's a bit later than what the journal hoped for, you're sort of more or less to get it in and to not go AWOL or hide under the duvet cover or whatever it is we do when stuff's building up. And I'll put on my chair hat for a second here. And that is one trick to respond quickly, to not dither. Am I going to do it? Am I not going to do it? Is to make a plan beforehand. How many referees reports do I think I'm going to do in an academic year? Am I going to do 6? Am I going to do 2? And when you have that number, you don't fret as much about, oh gosh, am I going to do this one, or am I going to wait for a better offer or something more interesting or whatever. So if you just kind of decide I'm doing 2 this year, I'm doing 3 this year, then, that sort of helps you plan your flow a little better. And another trick for timeliness, of course, don't do the author's work for them. We've said that already. Robert said much of what I would say about empathy. Write the kind of report you'd like to receive. I would add, write so that you will be heard. Knowing that critique stings a little, just, make sure that you're writing in a way that signals that you've read as carefully as you can. And be aware, and back to the point about subjectivity, be aware that, even if you think you've read carefully, you may not have read as carefully as you think you have. And you may miss stuff in the article. So it's best to sort of start from that position, perhaps of a bit of humility and straining, doing the author the courtesy of straining to understand their intentions. And again, even if the intentions aren't fully realized, and this is the spirit of Brian Martin's say what's good about the piece, even it may be that at the end of the day, what you end up saying is, you intended to do this really interesting thing, you didn't quite get there, but here's what you seem to be intending to do, and spell that out. So acknowledging that referees have their own strong emotional responses to papers, I think, is also a good place to start, and just, hold them in, I haven't been sufficiently cited, or my best friend hasn't been sufficiently cited, or, this is up the creek, or, whatever. Some journals have, in some cases, some of that emotion is warranted. And I would say we ask a lot of people from communities that have been marginalized, who are seeing yet another instance of hegemonic discourse in a journal. We ask them to be calm and impartial and what have you. And, that may be a lot to ask. But in any case, sometimes if you do have a strong reaction like that you think needs to be expressed, there's room for confidentially speaking to the editors, and remembering that, part of your job also can be, there are cases where you want to say something that this is not sufficiently original. It doesn't, there's a significant problem with it. Sometimes that's the place to do it. Just on specificity, maybe I will just go back to the quickly to the guidelines. And so, your journal's guidelines as to how to do a referee's report, usually there are some criteria. Be specific about those criteria. So for the CHR, there are two that I want to address here. Can't do all of them. So the first one is, does the article have the breadth and originality sufficient to interest readers? The question of fit can be an important criteria for assessing that, does this fit with the journal? And so it's important, as Robert said, to pay attention to the mandate of the journal. So if your journal's a general one, reaching a bigger audience, then say so. And I would just say quickly, don't neglect the question of writing when you're being specific. Is the article, is there anything to say about the way in which it's writing? Editors frequently end up with an accepted article, and there's work to be done with the writing. So if referees can be specific on that, it's a great help. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Merci. Alors, Léon, c'est à toi.
Merci, Amanda. Merci à la société. C'est vraiment une très belle initiative de rassembler des gens pour discuter d'une question comme ça qui, à la fois, est parfois des bons rappels pour des personnes plus établies dans le domaine, puis aussi pour la relève de voir mais comment on procède. J'avais déjà prévu, étant donné que je m'attendais que beaucoup de choses aient déjà été dites, je parlais un peu de la gestion des évaluations par une revue et comment, notamment le fameux évaluateur B, comment on peut gérer parfois des évaluations qui peuvent être très sévères. Alors, donc, peut-être juste rappeler à la RAF, on publie 12 articles par an. En fait, 14 l'an dernier, on a fait d'excellents articles et on publie environ 60% des articles qui sont reçus. Mais là-dessus, il y a un 20% pour lequel il y a eu un accompagnement substantiel, disons, des auteurs et des autrices pour arriver à quelque chose qu'on puisse publier dans nos pages. Du côté du comité de rédaction, bien évidemment, j'y siège en tant que directeur depuis 4 ans maintenant, et 4 autres membres qui ont des horizons très divers. Donc, des gens qui sont, évidemment, c'est des spécialistes en histoire d'Amérique française, mais de différentes périodes, des gens en histoire culturelle, en histoire intellectuelle, en histoire sociale. Donc, vraiment pour avoir une vue d'ensemble, parce qu'en tant que revue généraliste, nous avons besoin de ces regards-là très divers. Et c'est aussi un comité de rédaction qui est interventionniste. Donc, lorsqu'on reçoit d'abord les articles, il y a des articles qui sont bon, borderline, disons, et pour éviter justement qu'il y ait des évaluations inutilement sévères. Parfois, il y a des choses sur lesquelles des évaluateurs ou des évaluatrices vont accrocher et qui vont déclencher, on parle d'une réaction émotionnelle, parfois qui vont déclencher une réaction qui n'est pas nécessaire parce que le reste de l'article se tient. Donc, on va se permettre de demander aux personnes qui soumettent des articles de réviser des éléments pour éviter justement que l'évaluation soit inutilement négative. Donc, on a un rôle en amont à cet égard-là qui peut être agaçant parfois pour les personnes qui soumettent, mais qui, je pense, évite justement un choc lorsque ça vient des gens de l'extérieur et qui pourraient être évidemment agacés par certaines. On n'intervient pas si c'est mal écrit, ben bon, c'est mal écrit. Parfois, on va juste le rejeter parce que c'est trop mal écrit. Mais c'est vraiment parfois une problématique qui est mal étayée, une conclusion qui est bon, qui laisse de côté trop de choses. Donc, on essaie d'encourager les gens. Et parfois, il y a des choses que nous, on voit qui peuvent être améliorées au cours du processus. Par rapport aux directives que nous aussi, on soumet, tout comme la CHR, bon, on rappelle que c'est en double aveugle. On signale que d'éviter si quelqu'un est en conflit d'intérêt, positif ou négatif, de ne pas faire l'évaluation, parce que là, on a quelque chose qui est trop complaisant ou inutilement négatif. Et nous avons déjà eu des auteurs et des autrices qui nous ont demandé, voici une liste de personnes avec lesquelles je suis en conflit et que ça, bon, si vous voulez, vous pouvez quand même l'envoyer, mais bon, ça risque d'être... Donc, il y a des gens qui, en amont, justement, vont nous aviser de situations problématiques. Nous, parmi nos critères d'évaluation, évidemment, on aime que, justement, Robert nous disait au début quelle est la thèse de l'article. Et donc, on souligne, on rappelle aux personnes qui font les évaluations, est-ce que c'est clairement exprimé? Est-ce qu'on peut en tirer clairement une problématique? Et donc, l'historiographie, évidemment, est-ce que c'est bien indiqué? Et ça, c'est un des problèmes. Parfois, on a fait référence aux gens qui voudraient qu'ils soient cités. Et ça, c'est parfois un problème lorsqu'on essaie d'anonymiser une évaluation et que parfois, bon, il y a juste parmi 5 ou 6 suggestions de lecture, il va y avoir quelque chose qui est écrit par l'évaluateur ou l'évaluatrice, ça va. Mais lorsque parfois, les gens disent, il faudrait aussi référer à mes travaux, dont A, B, C, D. Et là, nous, c'est après ça, anonymiser une telle tournure de phrase, ça peut devenir difficile. Donc, non seulement, donc oui, si on glisse une autoréférence dans un bloc, c'est convenable, mais lorsque c'est vraiment une autoréférence évidente, ben là, nous, on a le travail à faire après ça d'anonymiser la chose. Ce qu'on rappelle aussi aux gens, c'est que oui, donc on veut quelque chose qui soit rigoureux, sans complaisance, et donc ce qu'on souhaite aussi, c'est que ce soit respectueux et constructif. Donc, c'est vraiment nos petites lignes directrices. Donc, en amont, on essaie d'intervenir de cette manière-là. Maintenant, aussi, ça, c'est un peu plus difficile à faire, donc on ne le fait pas, mais quand même, quand on écrit une évaluation, ce n'est pas notre article. Donc, ce n'est pas nous qui sommes... Donc, il ne faut pas que l'on rédige une évaluation pour faire ce que nous, on aurait voulu faire si on avait eu l'idée auparavant d'écrire cet article-là. L'autre personne a eu l'idée avant nous, c'est l'article de cet auteur ou de cette autrice-là. Donc, on peut amener l'article quelque part en ayant des commentaires constructifs, mais quand même, ça demeure l'article de l'auteur. Donc, ça, il faut quand même s'en rappeler. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait à ce moment-là quand on reçoit une évaluation particulièrement sévère, dévastatrice, etc., parfois même mesquine, parfois ça peut arriver, là, c'est que de notre côté, il y a toujours un message en fait, le comité de rédaction lit avec beaucoup de soin les évaluations et va relever ce qui est utile. Et dans le message qui est envoyé aux auteurs, on indique même avant on souhaite que les auteurs et les autrices lisent notre message avant de lire les évaluations. Et là, on va indiquer qu'est-ce qui doit être retenu, qu'est-ce qui est vraiment important. Et donc, à ce moment-là, ça aide à atténuer, parce qu'on envoie quand même les évaluations telles quelles. on ne va pas censurer, il faut anonymiser évidemment, mais on ne censure pas les gens, donc il faut quand même… mais je pense que le message qu'on envoie de dire, ben, voici les éléments à retenir, va aider à dire, ben, voici, il y a d'autres éléments qui sont peut-être justement moins utiles et ça va aider à adoucir un peu, mais quand même, on sait que parfois, il y a des évaluations qui sont très raides. Et donc, à ce moment-là, et nous-mêmes, on le lit, quand on le voit, on voit qu'ils vont recevoir ça, surtout pour les jeunes chercheurs, ce ne sera pas facile. Et donc, il faut juste aussi se rappeler c'est un accompagnement. On n'est pas là pour détruire les gens, on est là pour les accompagner. Donc, c'est vraiment un peu notre approche de ce côté-là. Et ça, il y a justement, à l'occasion, il y a des auteurs qui me renvoient un courrier en disant merci d'avoir tenu compte, parce que parfois, on a des évaluations très contrastées, une qui est positive, une qui est inutilement négative, et qu'on a su faire la part des deux et d'extraire de l'évaluation qui est négative, qu'est-ce qui permet de bonifier l'article et éventuellement, avec des révisions qui peuvent être très substantielles, arriver à quelque chose qu'on puisse publier. Et de ne pas tout simplement refuser un article parce qu'une des évaluations était négative et que l'autre était positive. Donc, parfois, c'est facile à l'occasion de juste dire non. Mais quand on voit à l'intérieur d'une évaluation qui peut être, qui dit de resoumettre, mais on peut, oui, avoir plutôt correction majeure, mais très majeure, disons, si on veut, et d'encourager l'auteur à nous soumettre quelque chose qui soit plus en ligne, là, qui réponde aux principales critiques constructives des évaluateurs. Et en fait, l'idée, c'est on évalue un texte, on n'évalue pas une personne. Et ça, je pense que c'est aussi important de le rappeler, que c'est un texte qu'on a devant nous et que les commentaires, parfois, et c'est là où c'est difficile de se retenir, de ne pas les enlever, lorsqu'on sent que ça tourne à une évaluation plutôt quelqu'un dit c'est un travail de bac ou quelque chose comme ça, c'est un travail vraiment inutilement là, négatif. Il faut évaluer le travail qui est devant nous et non pas essayer de passer des commentaires à propos de la personne qui l'a soumise. Donc, à ce moment-là, de notre côté, je pense que c'est vraiment de gérer… Il y a des trucs qui sont irrécupérables, et ça arrive qu'il y a des articles qu'on ne peut pas récupérer et que les évaluations, vraiment, on a parfois eu l'intuition, mais on n'est pas une revue généraliste, on ne peut pas tout savoir. Donc, on a eu l'intuition qu'il y avait des problèmes, on l'envoie en évaluation, ça confirme le problème. Et à ce moment-là, ben, voilà la situation. Mais c'est cet entre-deux-là où on a vraiment des évaluations très contradictoires, où le travail du comité de rédaction est vraiment de gérer la contradiction, de voir qu'est-ce qu'on peut en tirer. Et après ça, ben, à la direction de la revue, d'écrire un courriel qui peut être parfois très long, mais parfois avec des encouragements pour avoir le meilleur article possible après. Donc, merci de cette occasion de partager ces réflexions-là avec vous.
Oui, super, merci beaucoup. Belinda, you are next.
There, I think I'm unmuted. Hello, everybody, and thanks for the invitation. I'm the odd person out on this panel. I'm not myself a historian, but I'm editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies, and we do publish history. So I do handle, in my capacity as a reviewer, some of those papers. My own work, though, is as a geographer, as was mentioned, and kind of interdisciplinary fields of migration studies, African studies, gender studies, development studies. So I come from maybe a different position than some of the other people here, but I think the fundamentals are the same across those disciplines, if perhaps with some specific challenges for editors and for reviewers in a kind of interdisciplinary journal or paper targeted at an interdisciplinary journal rather than a history-specific journal. I thought I'd start by sort of thinking if we could step back a minute, like why do we do peer review? Like what's it for and what's it important? What's its importance? And I think, deserves restating how fundamental it is. It is the way by which we ensure kind of academic integrity and kind of scholarly standards. So whatever your role as an editor or a reviewer, that's why you're doing it. That's what you're doing it for, those kind of larger disciplinary and research goals, scholarly integrity goals. And in that, I think if we think of it that way, it helps if you think about it not as, look, I get an opportunity now to critique this paper, but I'm contributing to that wider disciplinary aim. And also to think about it as a collaborative process. Like when you review, it's not just a chance to show off your expertise. Like that's why we've asked you. We know you're an expert in the field, but it's it's you working with an editor and an author to make something better. So it's a conversation. I mean, it's a bizarre conversation. It's a stilted conversation, and the author doesn't know who you are in an anonymous review process, but it is a conversation. And if you think of it that way, it makes it kind of more approachable, I guess, as a reviewer, and maybe helps to kind of position a reviewer and make the comments more appropriate. You know, if you wouldn't make the comments kind of in a real conversation with the person, then maybe you shouldn't make them in your anonymous review. Or if you do make them, as has been said, make them in the confidential to the editor. You know, this really shouldn't be published because it's fundamentally flawed, but provide a kinder version of that in the comments to the author. The other thing that I think some reviewers don't necessarily realize, or perhaps some editors don't do, so maybe it's a double problem. When a reviewer gets sent a paper to review, that paper's already been looked at by at least one editor, possibly two. I mean, I often read a paper myself and I go, I'm not sure, but it's not my area. So I'll ask one of the other editors who is an expert in the field if they think it's worth sending out for review. And we often desk reject papers, like probably half of what comes in goes straight out and never sees review. So if you get it as a reviewer, it should already have been through that initial scan at least. So somebody thought it's at least worth sending out for review. That does mean that if you get it and you think it really shouldn't have been sent out for review, you can say this paper is not ready. It shouldn't have been sent to reviewers. Like send it back, get the author to sort stuff out, and then I'll give a considered comprehensive review. So editors need to do their job there and play that role. It's already been said, but I'll repeat it, that the particular journals, I mean, there are some general guidelines, but journals have particular aims and kind of scope of what they will publish. And also particular, I mean, it's not just kind of style in the kind of, you know, publishing, whether you have footnotes or kind of bibliography, in-text citations, house style, but there's a kind of tone to a journal. You know, I'm thinking of examples from my own field. So the Review of African Political Economy, for example, takes an explicitly kind of critical, I mean, stance on issues and argumentative positions on issues from various, you know, theoretical or ideological positions, but that's its kind of thing. Whereas other journals are less, I guess, theoretical, ideological, and are more empirically based, you know, so they're looking for different things. History is particular, but there are types of journals that are much more rigid about the kind of methods that they will accept. So in my journal that I'm the editor for, we don't publish like hardcore quantitative research. We just don't. We don't have the expertise. We wouldn't know how to find reviewers. So things are often desk rejected on that basis. But as a reviewer too, you should make yourselves familiar with the aims and scope and the kind of general tone and ambit of the journal. And then either say, yeah, I don't think this is a good fit, although the editor should have decided that in advance before sending it for review, or, you know, it doesn't quite fit, but it could fit if the author did the following, and then provide some kind of comments on how it can be made more appropriate to that journal. Yeah, I'm trying not to just do too much kind of repeat what other people have already said, but maybe to reinforce some of it. So the reinforce stuff, like it's not your job to edit the paper for English or for language in general. It is your job, however, to say that it's clear and well written, or it isn't clear and well written, and, you know, language needs whatever attention. The worst thing we get in an African studies journal is this needs editing by a first language English or, you know, French, because we're a bilingual journal person, and the person writing the article often is first language English or French. They just from a different country context and might write a bit differently from formal accepted whatever Canadian English or UK English. So that, you know, try and frame, give again general overall comments, but don't get into kind of policing what is or is not proper English or French, as the case may be. I think the other kind of more specific points maybe, don't be the kind of reviewer who says, well, this is the paper that I would have written. Here's how I would approach it. If you want to do that, write your own paper. Assess the paper that's there. If it really is so fundamentally flawed that it needs to be rethought, that's fine, but provide evidence. So it's not just an opportunity to say what you would have done, but what the author has done and what they could do better. Or if you are being completely subjective, then make that clear. If you are just expressing your kind of opinion, you're not a Marxist and this is a Marxist paper, and you find it offensive because it takes a Marxist approach, like that's you, but that approach is fine. So if you don't want to review it, that's fine, we'll find somebody else, but don't allow that kind of personal, don't be be subjective. All opinion is subjective, but don't be over subjective, and don't write something off because of your kind of personal preferences. So you can disagree with the author's opinions, but you should allow them to stand and be communicated, as long as they are supported by the evidence presented in the paper. So try and be objectively subjective. That doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean. Be clear when you're being objective, when you're being subjective, and don't allow your own subjectivity to occlude your objective assessment of the paper. Write the review that you would like to receive, absolutely. So I'd reiterate that very strongly, but just some kind of possible ways of doing that. I mean, I've noticed a substantial change, first as an author starting in the 1990s, then gradually being invited to review stuff in the kind of 2000s, and then from the kind of mid-2010s onwards, being an editor. There's been a substantial culture change in review. They used to be brutal, often like really brutal. When I think back on reviews that I received, or even reviews that I wrote, they were harsh in ways that I wouldn't imagine doing today. I mean, I blush to think of some of the things that I wrote in my early reviews. Partly when you're young, you think you're smart and clever than everyone else, and here's my expert opinion, and here are all the flaws with this paper. There has been a culture shift, and I think that's excellent. I mean, it was a long overdue culture shift. And I mean, some people are still nasty. It's really eye-opening being an editor. Some people still are mean, but others are much more constructive. So, the kind of change in language, and some of it is just language, but importantly, as has already been said, if you turn a criticism into a positive statement and an action statement, that's a whole lot more helpful. So just some phrases that you might use, and also say positive things. Start with, I mean, this is partly a Canadian cultural thing, and as an immigrant, it took me a while to get used to it, but the kind of, crap sandwich. Say the nice things first, and then end with the nice thing, and put the critical stuff in the middle, but also say it in a particular way. So start with saying, this is a really interesting manuscript. I enjoyed reading it. It's very well written. It addresses a hot topic. It has a great review of current literature, is up to date, etc., etc. So say the positive things first, and then you can say, however, there is still room for improvement. And then you can say, I really advise that they rewrite the introduction, that they better contextualize the piece within the current literature. I don't think there's enough robust data, or maybe in the historian's sense, enough sort of appropriate sources. They haven't used the sources effectively, or they're missing certain important sources to kind of support the conclusions that are drawn. The one that if a paper claims to fill a gap, as a reviewer, make sure that claim, I don't like gap framing, but as a reviewer, it's helpful to say, actually, there isn't a gap, and here are like 150 sources that this author hasn't cited on the same topic, or sign up that there's a good reason why there's a gap. But just, and again, substantively as a reviewer, say what the nature of the gap is, or if the gap doesn't exist at all. So, but again, in a constructive way. So you need to justify that claim more substantively. Again, the discussion could be expanded or deepened. The paper needs to provide more detail about I mean, again, not writing, but it's sometimes helpful if a reviewer can kind of see that the structure is awkward. And so if you rearrange the structure somewhat, then the narrative thread would be more clear and you could make your conclusion more strongly. So again, action terms. The positive language thing is really important. And as an editor, when reviews are expressed in that way, that makes it much more easy as the editor to give a decision and a constructive decision. And the key thing there is make sure that your language matches your recommendation. There's nothing worse than here's everything that's wrong with the paper, minor revision. Like, okay, how do you get from A to B? So if really all those things are wrong, it needs major revision or maybe should be rejected. So make sure that your comments and your recommendation cohere. Yeah, I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Len, you're next.
Okay, thanks very much. When this request came in, I was wondering, what it could bring to the table. And I had a brief conversation with Kyla, since we're the two book people here as opposed to journal articles. And the one thing I thought about was that books tend to be longer than articles usually, right? So it's the scope, the kind, and the audience that books have that might differ. And how will this help when you actually review a book manuscript? The one thing is the scope, right? Somebody may have written a political biography, and they may be approaching you as a political historian for that feedback. But it also might be covering a lot of gender, which you may not have published in, or other things. So keep this in mind when you take the manuscript on. What's your expertise? Why did the editor ask you to do this? And so where can you be the most helpful? And I think that's really important, right? I think edited collections are a really good example of that kind of thing. It's going to be a smorgasbord, right, of a lot of different articles, a lot of different kind of ideas. And when you're given that, you're not going to be an expert on every article. It's impossible, right? And you may have opinions and you may have good ideas for them, but keep in mind your own limitations and how you can be most helpful for the reader, for the actual editor of the book itself, not just the general editor in-house. The other is, and this leads from the edited collections, is the kinds of books that publishers work on, right? It might be a translation, right? And you're being asked to read this for a lot of reasons. One, the accuracy of the translation. Secondly, what should we publish it? We may not have the ability to actually revise it, right, for rights reasons, and there might actually be moral reasons as well where you may not want to revise the book. You may not be able to anyway. So keep that in mind. The editor who sent you that manuscript should be clear about this, and they will give you guidelines. But if it wasn't, ask them. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, right? The other kinds of books that you might see, and this also comes down to audience, right? That they may ask you to do, memoirs, right? I've done a number of memoirs here, and how does that fit with an academic press? Well, the guidelines don't really apply that would apply to an academic monograph. So when I actually have done memoirs, I've actually asked people to say, is this just suitable for us? Is this suitable, right? Is this suitable for a university press? Should it be published? Will it be of worth to the academic community, and in what way? Revisions are great, right? Other places, document collections, primary documents. I mean, you can't really change these. Are there anything that we can add as better structure? And then finally, in publishing, we do want to reach a broader audience than journal articles often will, right? That doesn't mean that a journal article won't make it into the broader public, but as a book, you have a greater chance. So publishers also push the envelope a little bit, or may want to publish things that are more of a synthesis, meant for everybody, but still academically sound. And when you're asked to do that, the editors, again, should be clear about it. And they should probably specify that this is what their goal is. But if not, ask them, right? I think that's a very good idea. So the audience will change. And keep that in mind, that it's often very much like that, right? That it's actually going to be a broader maybe than an academic audience. Not always. There's plenty of monographs sitting right behind me here in the library at the press. Plenty of those that the audience was academic and probably it reached mostly academic people. But there's plenty of books out there that just may, and university publishers actually want to. So when you're reading a manuscript and that's their goal, be clear. A lot of the other people commented about how to write a good report, a lot of stuff about typos and minor errors. I agree with that. That said, as a general editor, I welcome anybody, especially historians, when I'm doing historical manuscripts, for any kind of corrections in people's proper names, historical concepts. General editor and general copy editor may not catch these things, especially if it's idiosyncratic to an area. So those kind of points are actually kind of nice to have when you're a general editor. Outside of that, mostly it's just to listen to what the editor has asked, bring your level of expertise and where expertise is appropriate for a book manuscript. And when you're looking at an ed collection, I would think of a few things. Would definitely focus on the introduction. Does it bind the article, the book together? That's where feedback is most helpful, and both for the editor of the book and in the editor's house. Outside of that, I don't have a lot much to say right now that hasn't been said already, so I'll close off there. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Len. And next up, we have Kyla.
Hi, everyone. This has been so interesting, actually, and valuable. So I want to just begin by saying that, to thank the panel and the organizers and the panelists. And maybe just also, I would begin by saying, as has been said, what an important, essential part of the publishing process it is. I think it's the most important. And it's also has been my experience as an editor, such a rewarding one, because I learn so much from our peer reviews, and I am consistently amazed, sometimes astonished by the generosity of reviewers in giving time and attention to manuscripts. Book manuscripts can be long. Some of our books are very long, and the care and attention, collegiality of reviewers, there are some exceptions, but I honestly find it rare, is really remarkable and encouraging. So I want to just say that. And so much has been said about what makes a good review, and simply the succinctness of write the review you'd like to receive is just a way of putting it that I'll remember. The resource that Kate mentions on the U of T site, I'm going to look at when this panel is over. Since so much of this has been said already about being constructive and clear and specific and kind, I feel I don't need to repeat that, but I thought what I might respond to, hopefully this isn't straying from topic, is what happens when you get an A2 review? How do you respond to a critical review, or what we call the A2 review? Sometimes it's a little unfair. Sometimes the A2 is the dissenting voice, but it's a voice that we need. This is a perspective that is actually valuable for the author, but it is hard. It's hard to receive criticism. It's especially when it's delivered in a way that is unkind. It happens. What happens when you receive a critical report? And I just drawing on some of the things I talk about with authors, is sometimes you need to write it out, and sometimes you need to write a draft of your report that says or your response that says what you really think. And it's not something we can bring to our editorial board, but you might need to do it just to write it all down. But the response that you write, the response that we will send to our board and to our the ASVP, series editors perhaps, is it should be diplomatic and measured. It's one that, even if it is coming alongside one or two very positive reports, it's one our board reads, and we'll be interested in your substantive feedback to and response to the criticism you've received. So even if there are two other glowing reports in this file, it is answering the points, not referring to the reviewer in general or the review in general, but to the points that are made by the reviewer, why they are misplaced, why they are misinterpreted, why they are wrong, why this feedback is not good feedback. At the same time, looking for feedback in a critical report that may be useful. The reviewer may be telling you things that you need to hear and should address. Maybe it's not all of their comments, but maybe there is critical, useful feedback there. And I know our editorial board and ourselves are always impressed when authors can do that, can take some good, be receptive to useful comments, to corrections that come in an otherwise difficult report. The response that you write is also a plan for your revisions. And sometimes this will be a revision that is going back to readers. So make it clear, detailed, substantive, make it a plan for yourself about how you're going to approach your revision. Don't be afraid of 2 rounds of review. I sometimes say this to authors too. It happens quite often. It's not what we go for. We're not aiming for that. We love when things sail through 1 round of review. Honestly, many books, many award-winning books are 2 rounds of review, and they're made better by the process of having been seen by a reader, as readers a second time. And my last point I think I'd make is, as a reviewer, if you are asked to review a revised manuscript, please say yes. If you can, please say yes, because continuity is often important in peer review. The author has likely been guided by your suggestions, specifically by your revisions. The press is hoping that you will look at it again. It doesn't need to be as detailed as your original report. We'll give you a description of the revisions, so to hopefully speed things for you. But it's can be crushing to editors and authors when a reviewer says, I'm not able to do it. Sometimes it's not possible, but know that this report has been revised because of the manuscript has been revised because of the feedback that you gave. So we value your opinion of how successfully it has been implemented. That's all for me.
Thank you very much to Len and Kyla. That was a really useful perspective.
Thank you also to all people who showed up to listen to that. It was really helpful for you as well, I hope. Il ne reste plus qu'à vous remercier au nom de la Société historique du Canada d'avoir été parmi nous et à vous souhaiter un excellent temps des fêtes en espérant qu'il soit rempli de repos et de bons moments. Alors, merci beaucoup, plaisir de vous revoir bientôt. See you soon and hope you have a great holidays.